December 14, 1944. The air above the rolling farmlands of central Illinois shimmered with the bitter stillness of winter. Beyond the snow-flecked fences and leafless trees stood a cluster of barbed wire and guard towers. Camp Ellis, one of America's largest prisoner-of-war camps. Inside, a convoy of trucks rattled through the gates, bringing in a fresh wave of weary, frost-bitten men in tattered grey uniforms. They were veterans of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, captured in France and shipped halfway across the world. For many it was their first sight of America, and it was nothing like the nightmare they'd been warned about in the fatherland. War Department Report, Deck 1944. The German prisoners expected humiliation, hunger, perhaps torture. Nazi propaganda had told them the Americans were mongrelized barbarians, a people of chaos and cruelty. Yet what greeted them was order, precision, and something far stranger. As the trucks rolled past rows of wooden barracks, the men stared at a sight that made no sense. American soldiers unloading crates filled not with ammunition, but with bright red bottles capped in silver. A large painted logo gleamed in the pale sun, Coca-Cola. The scent of sugar and vanilla drifted through the cold air. Bundesarchiv POW diary fragment 1945. Inside the mess hall, the first meal was served. Hot stew, white bread, and, to the disbelief of hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, ice cream. Real ice cream, and pale, soft, sweet. A spoonful melted across their tongues, and some simply stopped eating, staring down as if they had seen a ghost. One soldier whispered, "Dies ist nicht möglich." This cannot be. Captured POW interview, U.S. Military Intelligence Division, 1945. The guards were mostly young men, respectful but firm, following regulations drawn up under the Geneva Convention. They treated us as humans, one former Panzer mechanic recalled decades later. It was the first time in years I did not feel afraid to fall asleep. U.S. Army Oral History Archive, 1972. The contrast was staggering. Back in Europe, the Allies were burning cities to rubble. American bombers thundered over Berlin and the Ruhr. Yet here, behind barbed wire in the American heartland, the enemy was fed, clothed, and even entertained. There were soccer matches, orchestras, literacy classes. Some camps even had small theaters where German prisoners performed plays. It was a world turned upside down, an inversion of war itself. Red Cross Inspection Report, Feb 1945. To the Americans running these camps, the treatment wasn't charity, it was policy. By late 1943, Washington had recognized that POW welfare could become a weapon of influence. Every well-treated German was a living message to the rest of the Reich, that the United States was not a brutal conqueror, but a civilized superpower, confident enough to feed its enemies dessert. War Department Memorandum, Psychological Warfare Branch, 1944. Still, to the Germans, it was almost intolerable. The taste of Coca-Cola, that bubbly, cheerful symbol of American abundance, mocked everything they had been taught. One diary from Camp Swift, Texas, records, "They give us Coca-Cola, this drink of the enemy. We once fought for honor and bread. Now we are shown what real bread is." Bundesarchiv POW Letters, 1945. Each evening when the loudspeakers played Glenn Miller or Benny Goodman, a kind of unease rippled through the barracks. The war had stripped them of their weapons, but the music, the comfort, the smiles of American nurses at infirmaries, these stripped them of something deeper, certainty. The realization dawned that perhaps Germany's industrial might had been outmatched not only by tanks and bombers, but by refrigerators, dairies, and soda fountains. U.S. Morale Operations Report, June 1945. Coca-Cola, in particular, carried a mythic presence. During the war, the company had promised that every U.S. serviceman, wherever he fought, would have access to a Coke for 5 cents, the same price as at home. To fulfill that promise, engineers designed mobile bottling plants mounted on trucks. These could be deployed from North Africa to Normandy. Each plant could churn out 30,000 bottles a day. Coca-Cola Company War Production Bulletin, 1944. When these units reached POW camps, the sight astonished captured Germans who had fought in shattered supply lines, starving amid shortages. Here was a nation that could deliver cold soda to the front lines, a luxury beverage in the middle of global war. The message was unspoken yet overwhelming. You have lost not just the battle of arms, but of systems, of scale, of spirit. U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps Report, 1945. Yet not all Americans approved. Some citizens wrote angry letters to newspapers, asking why the nation's enemies were being treated better than its own poor. Editorials appeared in regional papers, "Ice cream for Nazis," questioning the morality of indulgence for those who had brought destruction to Europe. The War Department's response was stern. Fair treatment was strategic. Each satisfied prisoner was worth more than propaganda leaflets dropped from planes. Chicago Tribune Editorial Archive, 1944. Meanwhile, behind those fences, transformation began. Some prisoners volunteered for agricultural labor, harvesting corn and cotton, grateful to escape barracks monotony. They earned small wages, bought soap and postcards, and often Coca-Cola. For many, it became a daily ritual, a cold bottle after a day's work, the fizz cutting through dust and heat. Decades later, a former German sergeant would recall, "It was the taste of peace." Texas Historical Society Oral Testimony, 1981. The psychological effect on both sides was subtle but profound. For Americans, it reinforced a belief that their nation fought not merely to destroy but to civilize. For Germans, it planted the seed of dissonance, a cognitive fracture between what they'd been told and what they saw. The war of ideology was dissolving in sugar and carbonation. U.S. Psychological Warfare Division Summary, July 1945, and yet beyond the fences the real war raged on. In Europe, the Ardennes forests were erupting in fire. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Snow and blood mixed on Belgian roads, while thousands of miles away, German prisoners in Kansas and Georgia sipped cold drinks under fluorescent lights. The contrast bordered on surreal. Army Signal Corps Dispatch Deck 1944. Those camps became a living paradox, places where the defeated learned that their captors' power came not from cruelty, but from abundance. For men raised under slogans of scarcity and sacrifice, the abundance was more terrifying than any weapon. They had been trained to believe in the hard virtue of struggle. Yet here was a society that waged total war without losing its softness. U.S. War Information Office Report 1945. In time, that soft power would prove more enduring than artillery. Many of those same prisoners would one day return to Germany and help rebuild it, carrying with them a quiet admiration for the strange decency of their former enemy. But that is still ahead in this story. For now, as the camp lights flicker against the night, and somewhere a guard hums along to a swing tune on the radio, the captured soldiers lie awake, haunted not by violence, but by kindness. They wonder what kind of nation fights like this. What kind of enemy gives its captives ice cream and Coca-Cola in the middle of a world war? The answer would come soon enough, in steel, in strategy, and in ideology. For beneath the sweetness lay something far more potent, a weapon built from culture, industry, and imagination itself. The secret behind America's strange generosity was neither sentimental nor accidental. It was strategic engineering, the merging of logistics, morale, and industrial mastery. By 1944, the U.S. Army had learned that comfort could be as decisive as combat. Behind every scoop of ice cream and every chilled bottle of Coca-Cola lay a vast machinery of production and planning, a silent army of engineers, factory workers, and logistics officers who understood that in modern war morale was fuel. War Department Quartermaster Corps Report, Jan 1945. The technical marvel began with refrigeration. The Quartermaster Corps' Food Service Division, under Colonel Paul Logan, had tasked General Electric, Frigidaire, and Carrier to create compact field refrigeration units. These could operate in deserts, jungles, or frozen forests, cooling everything from blood plasma to butter. The design featured an air-cooled condenser, sealed compressors, and a 24-volt system compatible with standard military generators. Each unit could chill 250 gallons of liquid per day. Technical Manual TM 10432-1943. On the battlefields of Europe, these systems meant medics had cold plasma. In POW camps across the U.S., they meant ice cream. Each machine, a triumph of American industry, blurred the line between the home front and the front line. For the Germans behind barbed wire, it was unthinkable. The enemy not only had air supremacy, but refrigeration supremacy. Captured POW Engineering Report 1945. Coca-Cola's own wartime miracle matched this military precision. In 1942, Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall issued a request to the company. make Coca-Cola available to every serviceman worldwide. Robert Woodruff, Coca-Cola's president, promised the same 5-cent bottle in every theater of war. To fulfill that vow, 64 mobile bottling plants were built and deployed to Allied bases from North Africa to the Pacific. Each unit was designed to operate from a truck chassis, complete with carbonation tanks, syrup pumps, and gasoline-powered compressors. Coca-Cola Overseas Operations Bulletin, 1943. Technicians nicknamed these machines Sweet Factories. Each could fill and cap 30,000 bottles a day, running at full capacity with minimal manpower. A single convoy could set up a bottling line in under 6 hours, a speed of deployment rivaling that of a field artillery battery. Army Service Forces Engineering Report, 1944. When word of this reached German POWs in the United States, disbelief turned to fascination. They sent Coca-Cola to Africa, one Luftwaffe pilot wrote home. They build machines to cool drinks in the desert while we march for water. Bundesarchiv letter collection, Gefangenschaft, 1945. That statement wasn't mere envy, it was revelation. The Germans had built V2 rockets that could reach London, but America had built a supply chain that could reach every foxhole on Earth. This was the hidden advantage, the power of comfort logistics. The Americans had mastered not only the industrial art of destruction, but also the industrial art of life support. They could sustain an army spirit as easily as its tanks. U.S. Army Quartermaster Technical Summary, March 1945. The secret extended into the POW camps themselves. Civil engineers from the U.S. Army Corps designed water filtration systems that could purify 10,000 gallons per day, ensuring every prisoner received potable water by Geneva Convention standards. Local dairies were contracted to supply milk and cream, not as charity, but as standardized calorie distribution. The diet of a German POW in an American camp averaged 3,200 calories daily, nearly equal to a U.S. soldier's ration. Army Nutrition Report, 1945. Then came the decisive psychological experiment, controlled exposure to American culture. The Office of War Information's Psychological Warfare Division supplied films, magazines, and even radio broadcasts to select camps. These weren't propaganda reels. They were slices of daily American life. Baseball games, factory tours, swing bands. The prisoners saw women welding ships, black and white soldiers eating together in canteens, families smiling despite ration books. It was culture as a weapon, designed not to humiliate but to humanize. OE Cultural Operations Memo, 1945. But perhaps the most telling test came during the summer of 1945, at Camp Aliceville, Alabama, a sprawling complex holding more than 6,000 German prisoners. The camp's commander, Colonel Clarence Ross, was an engineer by training and a psychologist by instinct. Under his supervision, POWs were allowed to form committees, run libraries, and even brew near beer using surplus malt syrup from army stores. Yet one experiment drew particular attention from visiting War Department officials. The Coca-Cola Day, Camp Aliceville Command Log, July 1945. On that day, the camp's canteen distributed 4,000 bottles of Coca-Cola, chilled to perfection. A band played Glenn Miller's In the Mood as German prisoners stood in line, some laughing, others hesitant, most silent. A War Department photographer captured the moment. Former enemy soldiers, sunburned and uniformed in U.S.-issue work clothes, holding glass bottles with condensation beading down the sides. U.S. Signal Corps Photo Archive, 1945. Reports afterward noted a measurable drop in disciplinary infractions. Prisoners worked longer hours on farm details. Conversations between guards and inmates grew friendlier. The effect of a single day of humane indulgence, one observer wrote, was greater than weeks of interrogation. War Department Field Psychology Report, Hague, 1945. German officers in particular were deeply unsettled. Her diary entry reads, "How can they afford to waste resources on us? Either they are mad, or they have resources beyond reason. If they can give coke to prisoners, what can they give their soldiers?" Bundesarchiv reconstructed POW journal. That realization struck harder than any bombing raid. For the first time, many German officers understood that America's industrial capacity wasn't just vast, it was compassionate. The factories that built Sherman tanks and B-17 bombers also produced soda caps and ice cream churns. The same railroads that delivered munitions delivered milk. And in that duality lay the secret of total war, efficiency and empathy intertwined. U.S. Industrial Mobilization Report 1946. Meanwhile, Coca-Cola engineers, often overlooked in wartime histories, became unsung logistics heroes. Men like Raymond Powers and John Paul Austin refined the carbonation pressure systems, while mechanical teams designed hand-cranked bottlers for use without electricity. At the Detroit Arsenal and Mobile Equipment Command, mechanics modified Army trucks to carry bottling rigs, creating a fleet of fizz trucks that followed divisions across Europe. Army Logistics Technical Circular 15-3, 1944. The Axis never understood this dimension of warfare. Their doctrine treated comfort as decadence. Hitler's generals believed endurance and sacrifice defined victory. But America's engineers weaponized comfort, proving that morale could be mass-produced, packaged, and delivered worldwide. Wehrmacht Psychological Analysis, U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The moment of ultimate contrast came not in Europe, but across the Pacific. In August 1945, as Japanese POWs began to arrive at temporary camps in Hawaii, many were emaciated, terrified, expecting death. Instead, they too were served sweet drinks and fruit. When one interpreter explained Coca-Cola, a former Japanese naval officer bowed deeply, saying, "Then we are already defeated, by spirit." U.S. Navy interrogation transcript, served 1945, back in the American heartland, the lessons of comfort warfare deepened. As engineers refined bottling logistics, psychologists compiled data. Camps with higher quality food and amenities reported fewer escape attempts and greater cooperation in post-war re-education programs. The relationship was mathematical. Kindness reduced chaos. Office of War Information Statistical Annex, 1946. By war's end, over 400,000 Axis prisoners had tasted this paradox, treated not as beasts but as men. Given glimpses of the abundance that had defeated their nations, they saw that American victory didn't come solely from superior weapons, but from a civilization so confident it could spare sweetness for its enemies. The German prisoners who drank Coca-Cola and tasted ice cream in captivity would carry that memory into Reconstruction. They'd remember the machines that hummed behind fences, the guards who smiled, and the taste of a drink that symbolized a new world, cold, carbonated, unstoppable. Post-war POW interview, U.S. Army Historical Division, 1948. And yet, behind this triumph of spirit and system, deeper questions lingered. Questions about the cost of compassion in total war. Could generosity coexist with justice? Could industrial kindness reshape conquered hearts without erasing the horrors they had caused? Those answers, and their consequences, would emerge in the years after 1945, when the prisoners went home and the war for memory began. By the spring of 1946, the barbed wire fences across America were thinning. Train whistles cut through the morning fog as columns of German prisoners began the long journey home. They boarded with duffel bags full of Red Cross rations, letters and photos, and something else invisible but enduring, a sense that they had glimpsed the future. The war was over, but the influence of Coca-Cola and ice cream, those improbable emblems of captivity, was only beginning. War Department POW Repatriation Report, May 1946. Many of these men had entered the camps as soldiers of a collapsing empire. They left as witnesses to a civilization built not on tyranny or fear, but on abundance, freedom, and faith in technology. Their memories would ripple through post-war Germany, shaping hearts and industries alike. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Psychological Effects, 46. When they disembarked at Bremerhaven or Hamburg, gaunt from the Atlantic crossing, they found cities in ruins, brick dust, twisted rail, silent factories. Yet within that desolation, small American miracles began to appear. Aid packages stamped U.S. Army, UNRWA, or CARE contained tins of powdered milk chocolate, even Coca-Cola syrup. For some former POWs, it felt like déjà vu, the taste of captivity returning as the taste of Reconstruction. Bundesarchiv, POW Repatriate Diaries, 1946. In interviews conducted by Allied intelligence in the summer of 1946, several repatriated prisoners described their captivity as a conversion experience, not ideological, but emotional. They had everything, even for their prisoners, one former sergeant told interrogators. They won because they had more than tanks. They had happiness. U.S. Army Interrogation Division, June 1946. The psychological weight of that realization echoed across Europe. American kindness, however calculated, became a strategic weapon in peace as it had been in war. The Marshall Plan, announced a year later, was the logical continuation of that ethos. Feed the defeated, rebuild the destroyed, and make prosperity the most persuasive argument for democracy. Marshall Plan Policy Draft 1947. In occupied Germany, Coca-Cola's red and white banners soon fluttered again, rising from rubble. The company reopened its Essen plant in 1946, under Allied supervision. Within a year, distribution extended across the American zone. Bottles rolled down conveyor belts rebuilt by German workers, some of whom had first encountered the drink in captivity. Coca-Cola Germany Reconstruction Memo 1947. Engineers who had once worn field grey now operated American machinery. Electric compressors and chillers similar to those used in POW camps became the backbone of the new German food industry. Dairy plants, cold storage warehouses and ice cream parlors multiplied in cities still bearing the scars of bombing. These weren't luxuries anymore. They were symbols of rebirth, cold proof that modernity had returned. Federal Economic Administration Report 1948. This industrial revival carried a quiet emotional undercurrent. The same men who once labored under Allied guards now taught apprentices how to fix refrigeration units, how to maintain carbonation lines, how to deliver milk safely across war-torn roads. Some even admitted, decades later, that they modeled their factory discipline on what they'd seen in American camps. Safety inspections, efficiency charts, clean workspaces. Oral history, Arbeiten im Wiederaufbau, Hamburg Technical Museum, 1973. To the Allies, this was vindication. American planners in 1944 had argued that humane treatment wasn't just moral, it was practical. The U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division calculated that 60% of repatriated POWs exposed to fair treatment would resist extremist ideology after the war. Their findings were later confirmed in West German political behavior studies. Former U.S. POWs integrated faster, favored democratic institutions, and distrusted militarism. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1947. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the moral debate continued. Some citizens still questioned why captured Nazis had enjoyed luxuries, while American families rationed sugar. Yet veterans who had guarded the camps wrote letters defending the policy. One Iowa veteran wrote, "We didn't beat them by starving them. We beat them by showing them what civilization looks like." Midwestern Veterans Association Newsletter, 1948. That philosophy, to defeat hatred with normalcy, became a cornerstone of post-war American identity. It wasn't a matter of sentiment, but of supremacy through compassion. The ability to provide, to comfort, to refrigerate became the hallmark of a new global order. In the Cold War that followed, the same logic powered America's cultural offensive. Jazz, jeans, and soft drinks doing what armies once had. U.S. Information Agency Cultural Analysis 1950. In this sense, the POW camps were laboratories for a new kind of warfare, psychological, industrial, human. What began as an experiment in morale management evolved into the architecture of Pax Americana. War Department Morale Services Retrospective, 1951. Inside Germany, the former prisoners' stories spread in taverns and workshops. They had refrigerators everywhere, one man said in a Berlin cafe in 1947. They even made ice cream for their guards. The comment drew laughter, disbelief, then reflection. Slowly, the myth of American excess transformed into aspiration. Der Spiegel feature Kalte Frieden, 1953. By the 1950s, Coca-Cola had become a cultural ambassador. Its red trucks rolled through Munich, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg, cities where less than a decade earlier, sirens had screamed nightly. Teenagers sipped Coke while listening to swing, and later rock and roll. German dairies began mass-producing frozen desserts, introducing American-style sundaes and sodas into post-war cafes. The imagery of war gave way to neon lights and chrome stools. Coca-Cola Company European Division Report, 1954. The transformation was profound and paradoxical. The very men who once swore loyalty to a regime that worshipped hardness were now rebuilding their lives around comfort, sweetness, and peace. In interviews from the 1960s, several former POWs described their American captivity as our first taste of democracy. They didn't mean politics. They meant the feeling of being treated as an individual, the freedom to smile, to choose, to live without fear. Goethe Institute Oral Archive, 1966. Yet even amid this soft triumph, the ghosts of war remained. Some veterans confessed guilt, unable to reconcile their humane treatment with the atrocities they had once ignored or committed. They gave us ice cream, one man told a researcher in 1971, while we had burned villages in Russia. I still taste the shame. Frankfurt Psychological Research Notes, 1971. The US government, too, wrestled with the legacy. Declassified reports from the 1950s reveal internal debates over whether the POW experience had been too lenient. But the data spoke for itself. The re-educated, well-fed prisoners were the least susceptible to Soviet recruitment in divided Germany. In the shadow war of ideology, sweetness had beaten steel again. CIA analysis, POW Influence Index, 1955. By the 1980s, historians began to call it the sugar strategy, a term describing how the United States used its industrial abundance as moral leverage. The same factories that supplied soldiers in World War II became symbols of global aspiration. Refrigerators, cars, and soda bottles became quiet emissaries of a new empire, not of conquest, but of comfort. Smithsonian Cold War Cultural Exhibition Catalogue, 1982. Even in the 21st century, the story lingers. Some German villages still hold reunions for former POWs who had been detained in nearby American camps. They come as old men, smiling, clutching faded photos of baseball games played under barbed wire, of Christmas dinners with powdered ice cream and Coke. The same prisoners who once feared their captors now toast them with cold bottles of Coca-Cola. Oral testimony, Gefangene und Freunde, 2003. Their words are simple, unpolished, yet they carry the weight of history. They beat us, not because they were cruel. They beat us because they were kind. In the end, the ice cream and Coca-Cola that bewildered German POWs were never trivial. They were symbols of an industrial civilization that could afford humanity. A weapon forged not in secret labs, but in factories, kitchens, and assembly lines. The same spirit that built bombers also built bottle caps. The same discipline that filled cartridges filled cones. U.S. War Production Board Retrospective, 1949. The story closes not with a battle, but with a paradox, that the world's bloodiest war ended for some in sweetness. In the glow of mess hall lights, amid laughter and disbelief, men once sworn to tyranny tasted freedom, not in speeches or treaties, but in something cold and ordinary. Because in the 20th century's greatest conflict, the true measure of victory wasn't who could destroy the most, but who could build the best, who could create a world where even prisoners could taste peace. And so, as history fades into memory, one truth remains. In modern war, power is not only the ability to fight, but the capacity to feed, to comfort, to forgive,